going? So, my name is Jake Redson. I am a wildlife forest garden designer, and this is a workshop, an online live streamed workshop, which is kind of it's for the record. It's for documenting it because we didn't record the actual workshop, which took place on the 14th of September in 2024 this year. So today is the 20th of December, but I wanted to get a record of the slideshow so that it's out there. So I'm going to talk about introducing the Hope Garden, what the Hope Garden is. It's a community space at the heart of the Wildlife Forest Garden in Kilgarran, in North Pembrokeshire, in Wales, which is a country in the United Kingdom, which is in Europe. There we go. So, a couple of things. First of all, these slides are always available at hopegarden.uk/slides/intro. And if you hold down the P key, you will see there's a whole load of notes in there as well. So, I bought the domain name as part of the project. The domain name is going to be live for 10 years. So, all this material will be documented for you. Okay, so I'm going to go fair lickety-split just because there's quite a lot. It's a couple of hours. I'm going to try and get done maybe a bit quicker than a couple of hours. We'll see how we go. Oh, crikey, it doesn't like being full screen. Why don't you like being full screen? There we go. So the agenda is divided up into four. The first thing is the ideas behind the Hope Garden. The second part is forest garden. What is a forest garden? Then it's looking at the wildlife garden aspect, and then looking at community assembly. And a community assembly is a way of organising a decision-making process. So it's kind of open access, non-hierarchical decision-making process. That's actually quite good. I'll write that down. So there won't be a tea break, and there is no free lunch, but there was on the day. Open access, non-hierarchical. So this is kind of it's interesting stuff. Let's get a move on. So the first of the workshops, if you search for Hope Garden, you should find these workshops. We've done the introducing the Hope Garden, which is this one. The Wildlife ID workshop went well. Wildlife garden design was good. I ran that one again. I'll do an online version of this. And then perennial vegetables. There's a trip to Steph Hafferty's, which was great, really interesting. She's an organic no-dig gardener, and she does a lot of perennial vegetables. How to run a community assembly. We had to postpone that one, so that will be probably in June. But we need to organise that. And then the next workshop that we have is fruit tree pruning with Martin Hayes. Martin Hayes is a bit of a champion. Orchardist, internationally renowned in the orchard world. He's a good bloke as well. He's a good friend of mine. Tree planting with Martin as well. Saturday, 22nd of February. Gonna see how that goes because it might not be that we might not be in a state where everything's in place because there's a lot of building going on at the moment. And the Greenwood benchmaking workshop, which I think is fully sold out. There's only like 6 places on that. Outdoor workshop, and this is going to be in April, and this will be run by Phil at Blue Green Cymru, who is a partner organisation, and there's a foraging workshop in May. So yeah, they're all kind of related workshops to the Hope Garden, the ideas behind the Hope Garden, which is a community space in a wildlife forest garden. So this is the site as was, and it's just next door to Penavoyage allotment, which is just it's a 5-minute walk from the centre of Kilgarran, and it's just in this space here. There's a triangle of land, and already the landscaping has already begun since this photograph was taken. And there's a track in there, and there are banks, and there's ditches, and it's all starting to come together, which is very exciting. And context is a Google satellite photograph of Kilgarran, and it's always a really good idea to look at where the garden is situated and what the surrounding area is like. So we've got the main feature of is the Avon Tavy, the River Tavy, and this is incredible. It's an old, there are old slate quarries all the way along the Tavy as well. So Kilgarran's fortunes were built on the on the slate, and there are three. I mean, it's quite incredible, really. There are three nature reserves. So there's Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales headquarters, which are up in the Wildlife Centre and Tavy Marshes, and that's about a mile up the road. And that's worth a visit. So there's an awful lot of there's marshland obviously, and a lot of wetland bird species and all sorts of species go on there. So that's a real hotspot. And then there is the NRW. Goodness me, I've forgotten the name. It's just here. It's quite literally just across the road. Coidmore Mansion, and there's a nature reserve, small nature reserve there with public access. And then there is the Wildlife Trust has another wildlife, about 20 acres, I think it is, which is Coed Maybe Goddard. So you look on the Wildlife Trust South West Wales, and that's over there. So there's a lot of kind of biodiversity in that area, with the river joining everything up and the three different wildlife reserves. Then there's the village park, Park or Pump, which is here. There's parking in the centre down by the river, which is free parking. And then you've got Kilgarran Football Club. There's an awful lot going on in the area as well. Some really, really good work going on. Finon Finon Resilience, or CIC, who do a lot of work with Fruit and Nut Club, and then there's the allotment, that red square down the bottom, and then the Hope Garden is that little triangle there. So what we're going to be doing is packing in a whole lot of biodiversity and a variety of different species of perennial vegetables and edible perennials in there. We have to ask the question, why are we here? This is kind of fundamental. We're here to promote life. This is the butterfly of hawk's moth. This is the caterpillar of the hawk's moth, large hawk's moth. Yes, which was on the site. So it's an absolutely incredible creature, and this is what is driving what we are doing. And there is some degree of conflict here as well, because to create a garden, we actually had to remove the grass and remove the habitat where that particular caterpillar was possibly hibernating. So we might have actually destroyed that particular caterpillar hibernating over winter to create the banks to be able to put the garden in. There is it's a 5 acre field, and there will be other caterpillars hibernating elsewhere, but there is there is always disturbance and there is always damage. So the kind of key question is, how do we limit that? And then what do we, when we're creating these spaces, are we creating more biodiversity? And really it comes down to nature and climate emergency, and there is a picture of it was the I think it was the wildfires in Canada from a couple of years ago. You get the idea. It's happening now. There are floods, there are fires, there are rising sea temperatures, mass extinctions. So what do? Not business as usual. We actually start to create things locally. I think it's the most positive and the best thing that can be done is to take action. And this action can form in a number of different ways. It can be a political act, it can be a demonstration, it can be for a particular organisation, but everything that is supporting life is the key to this. So the idea for the Hope Garden, originally, I'll just give you a quick introduction to the Hope Garden. I've been doing a lot of work with Extinction Rebellion and gardening as well, and I said it would be a good thing it'd be quite interesting to put a wildlife forest garden into an RHS show, and this is going to be Hampton Court, and the idea of a community assembly. You can see there's all kinds of gathering of people, and it's kind of yeah, the idea was to have like an event within an event, and then run these workshops with the people coming in talking about the nature and climate emergency and gardening and the kind of wide context. Because there'll be a lot of journalists there, and there'll be a lot of it's everything that traditional horticulture isn't. I believe that's a very large aspect of it. It's become an industry and a way. This is where we make money. This is the most important thing. Whereas it should be that creating habitat and supporting life is the most important thing. And that can be human life, and that can be wildlife as well. It's not, they are not exclusive. So that was the original plan. Then I said, well, it would be great to have a prototype of this and to get one to create a garden actually in situ. And to be honest, a real garden, a true garden, but a true garden takes years. And it's not something that is a show garden. Is like set dressing, and it's no disrespect to show garden people who make show gardens, because there's a vast amount of work and a vast amount of skill goes into them, but they are not quote unquote real, because they are not lived, experienced spaces. This is the kind of critical thing. Oh, I don't want to go off on a tangent and talk about. There's some incredible books. There's a brilliant book called How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand, and it looks at lived in houses and how houses are, if they're lived in, they are their homes, whereas you can have space which is created like a show garden, and it's a show. It's not, it kind of expresses things, but it isn't the true thing itself, whatever that is. So there's a wildlife garden aspect of it as well. So again, supporting habitats for native species where possible, and create habitat. Because native species, because wildlife eats insects. Everything eats insects, and insects eat plants, and native plants are the kind of foundation of the food web and the soil as well. The forest garden is an edible. The idea behind the forest garden is an edible perennial garden, so I'll be looking at that later on. But these are the three constituent elements of the community assembly, where it's a non-hierarchical, open access decision-making process, and within a wildlife forest garden. And so a absolutely key takeaway from all this: pobl, tir a natur, people, land, and nature. So the critical thing is humans can be a force for good. There is nothing to stop us apart from our economic, social, and political systems that are currently in place, but there is nothing theoretically to stop us from creating a more biodiverse world than we currently inhabit. That's the bottom line. We can do it. We have done it. There's a brilliant book called Ending the Wild by Kat Anderson, who looks at land management techniques of indigenous Californians and culture, and their increased biodiversity. This is the critical, fundamental point. It can be done. So another really great book which I read recently is called Tir, Land, by Carwyn Graves, and he talks kind of similar thing but from a Welsh perspective. And it's a photograph of a wood meadow in, and I think the key, this is my favourite go-to academic paper. Like everyone obviously has got a favourite academic paper. My one is When Culture Supports Biodiversity, the case of the wood meadow. And it's just the sheer amount of diversity in a wood meadow. And a wood meadow is, as it sounds, it's wood and it's a meadow, so it's cut for grass, and trees are grown as well. And it can take a number of different forms. So it can be trees grown for timber, trees grown like coppice. It can be an orchard. But the idea is it's like a forest garden at scale. And in Estonia, just for various reasons, they kind of reached the peak, I think, about the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. And it's just like the sheer diversity. I think it's 76, that was it, 76 species within a square meter, I think is a kind of record. which is just absolutely incredible. If you compare that to, we've got semi-natural grassland. I think in Wales it's about 30 species per square metre is the kind of average or record. So yeah, maybe a bit more might be the average. I think it's about 20 species per square metre is the average in England. So yeah, vast biodiversity. But what this does require is a culture shift. And this is a quote from Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Juice. And yeah, and that's a photograph of sweet chestnuts. So if we're going to, what we are faced with is massive food shortages and the collapse of international trade routes. And at some point in the future, not so I don't know who knows when. And what we really need to be doing is looking at local, resilient, biodiverse food systems. But that requires a culture shift. This is like, yeah, it needs to be on all sorts of levels. I don't know how you do it, but I think this is the conversations we need to be having. These are the big questions that we need to have. So the Hope Garden is a multi-threaded, multi-layered garden. So there's lots of different things going on within that space. The first one is we're going to be growing resilient crops, and I've got there's a fantastic spreadsheet of all the plants that are down the list for growing in the Hope Garden. There's a whole lot of fruit bushes and perennial vegetables, and there's nut trees, there's hazels, there's hawthorn, a Crimean hawthorn. There are just a whole, yeah, I think it's quite a lot. It's a lot of different resilient crops that we're growing in the Hope Garden. And the garden that we're creating, because it's self-sustaining, it's a self-sustaining, self-contained garden as far as it provides its own nutrients and some pest control. We're growing resilient ecosystems, so we've got native plants in the mix as well to support as many native insects as possible, because the native plants are food plants for the invertebrates. And we're creating resilient networks too. So you can just about see in the photograph there the little couple of green school shirts. Those are the local school, that's called Kilgarran. There's a group that come down. They will be coming. We've got some grant funding sorted out for it as well. They're coming down to do wildlife observations and use the canvas covered area as an outdoor classroom. And this is part of building a resilient network where people can see what's going on, they have a place to meet, and they are engaged in nature and engaged in this space. And it goes on, I think the wider point is about policy. Decoupling food from profit is, for me, is the key thing. We shouldn't be growing food for profit. That shouldn't be the model. It should be a different alternative economic model, because you can't have a resilient local food system if you are growing food for profit, because it's not doable, it's not credible. I mean, just look at the margins which farmers are operating on. Wales imports 95% of fruit and vegetables. I think that's correct. Might be I think that's fruit and vegetables. 95% is imported, which is ridiculous, because we can grow vast amounts of fruit and vegetables in Wales, and there is actually a really good history, for example, of orchards in Wales which have been lost, and this is due to their economic systems. And so the aims of the project. You can see a little sketch, one of the first sketches of the space. It's really simple, canvas covered area, but the idea is a blueprint. So people say, I like that, I want that community garden, that community space, those perennial vegetables, those fruit bushes and trees. So it's a blueprint. It's like, this is how we've done it, and obviously each site's going to be different, each group's going to be different, but people can access that. So it will be a documented blueprint and a kind of best practice model about how to go about these things. Really, for me as well, perennial veg collection, and it's kind of very interesting. What's happening is these different elements are coming to the fore. As the work is done, these different elements are coming to the fore, and it's thinking of it like a library. And what I think that's fantastic is, like, you have a perennial library, a perennial plant library, where people can come and take cuttings. We've got a whole load of different logan berries and thorns, blackberries, and red currants, white currants, black currants, all sorts of different bushes where you can take cuttings and grow them on, and then share them out locally. So it's like people can take out plants and then they can give plants back as well. But it's like a collection, and that kind of yeah. I just love that idea. Perennial plant library. I'm going to call it from now on. And it's a workshop space. So really, the key one for me here is the outdoor classroom. So just having the kids from the local school was brilliant. Was like it was a real eye opener, and it was one of the best things. It's actually quite difficult. I was very concerned that the kids would get bored, but they didn't. They spent 2 hours running around, just lots happening with different insects and looking for different things and different plants, and it was a great experience. And I think I just wanted to have that as a thing, as a regular thing for the school, that it's this kind of ongoing education about nature, and you need to have the space for it, and this is the space for it. So for me, it's the perennial plant library and the outdoor classroom are really, really kind of foundational at this stage. They're really foundational. And the other thing is the workshop space. There is the option. I mean, for running workshops, I used to run quite a few forest garden workshops in the past. And it's about having the space. But there, if all the plants are there and there is a space there, then that is an opportunity for me to run workshops and to make some money from doing it as well, and put some money back into the garden. So that's a possibility, and also other community groups as well. And it's a way of generating a bit of income. So that would be fantastic. And yeah, finally, a garden for future generations. This is something that has been maintained, but it's something that is quite a good honourable aim for Hope Garden. So features, covered meeting space. As I said, this is a brilliant sketch by Marianne, who's a landscape designer who's on the project, and she's really helped out with that. Covered meeting space with benches. We're going to get a little kind of storage unit for the benches. They'll be made out of round wood by local woodworker called David Hunter. Water fountain, so that people can drink water and make cups of tea. There's a little tea garden. We've got different varieties of mint, and there'll be like a herb garden there as well for and a tea garden. And then like a fire, so people can make cups of tea, and there will be teacups. There'll be those outdoor teacups. Gabion habitat. Got to build this into the infrastructure. But Gabions are fantastic. They're like units. As John Little, the gardener, calls them. The Gabions are like units of wildlife habitat, I think is the term he used, because you can just fill them with all sorts of different materials and aggregates, and they provide fantastic habitat. And you can put bee dogs into them, you can put craggy rocks into them, you can put recycled aggregate, crushed bricks, or all sorts of different things into them. We'll use them for the bird bath and water fountain, and a couple other things as well. So I'm just thinking about how to use them. I've got to go on to the design in a while. And raised beds, because the site is so wet, to increase the amount of biodiversity, you want different grow mediums. So we actually got raised banks there, which are great, but I need also to look at raised beds and then putting perennial vegetables in those beds, because some plants don't like it. It's kind of heavy clay and very wet site, and very wet part of the site as well. So raised beds kind of get around that. There's species that you put in there which like to be much drier. So really, it's a kind of direct community action forest garden. Direct community action grassroots garden. Okay, fantastic. There we go. Little I'll have this little quick break now. Let's go on to a forest garden. So we've got an overview of the Hope Garden. So what is a forest garden? If you can think of picture an orchard, so you have a mixed orchard. It's not just apple trees, it's apples, pears, plums, Asian pears possibly. Have some nut trees in there, hazels. You could sneak in a little sweet chestnut, possibly a walnut, not too near to the apple trees. And picture this orchard with a whole variety of different fruit and nut trees in it. So you have that, and then you think, well, you're going to have what happens with that orchard. You do have like windbreaks, but the windbreaks that you grow in the native plants. And then you think, well, it'd be nice to put some fruit bushes in as well. So you put some fruit bushes in, and then you think, well, it'd be nice if we had some perennial vegetables in there too. So you kind of clear some of the ground, put perennial vegetables in, use native plants as a ground cover. So it's like a wildlife, and you're building up all these different plants and the different native plants in an orchard. So it's like a wildlife orchard with perennial vegetables and fruit shrubs. So that is one kind of definition of it. Another definition is it's an edible ecosystem. This is essentially what you're creating. So the key to a forest garden is that you're not requiring any more, you're not importing any fertility into the garden. It's already growing enough itself. So you have nitrogen fixing plants, potassium, like for example, alders or sea buckthorn or members of the pea family, Siberian pea tree, for example, and all the nutrients are there, but also the pest control as well. Because you're creating habitat, because you're using native plants, you're encouraging as many invertebrates as you're building as much habitat as you can, so you get the insects in, which sounds counterintuitive, but then you get the predators of those insects in as well, and then you have a healthy living ecosystem and it's in balance. So it's a balanced edible ecosystem. So growing edible crops in a wildlife garden is another way of looking at it. So I think they're really, really intertwined. The idea of edible crops and wildlife, quite traditionally they're seen as annual vegetables, and you want to have it all kind of consistently hoed, no without any weeds. Whereas, and then you have a wildlife garden, but this is kind of marrying the two together because they can be complementary. So this is Martin Crawford's. He's a famous forest garden down in Devon. Has a beautiful site down there, 2-acre forest garden. He's a couple of different forest gardens, and he has a nursery, and he's got a perennial hothouse, the glass house. So this is and this is lovely. This is like if you ever get the chance, if you're in Devon in the UK in England, then please do go and have a look and book up on a tour. The sense for it, so it's trees and it's vegetables and it's fruit and it's all sorts of different things going on. It's a very different feel. So this is taken with permission from his book, Wild Nature Forest Garden, and you got from the further right you move, the greater the greater the fragility of the system, and also the greater amount of input that's required. So arable cultivation, annual arable cultivation requires a vast amount, and you kind of get less. So that's a really nice way. Wild nature, forest garden, orchard, pasture, and arable cultivation. And the characteristics are it's sustainable, because you don't have to bring in manure, you don't have to bring in any kind of external herbicide or pesticides or anything. You can keep on kicking over. So this is the photograph here is a cut and drop, what's called cut and drop. You grow comfrey, which is high in potassium. Potassium is required by fruiting plants and tomatoes, for example, and fruit trees. So I grow comfrey next to a fruit tree, and then I chop it and then just drop it in place. But you can do it for a long time, and it's sustainable, permanent living mulch. Yeah, so you have in that photograph you have a native ground cover, native plants as a ground cover, so you constantly keep the ground covered as well. And there is intervention, but there is maintenance required, but it's much lower maintenance. And it's a productive space as well. This is I believe this is Cornus capitata, which is Bentham's Cornel, and this was at a National Trust property in Pembrokeshire called, goodness me, what's the name of the place? Not Corbin. Colby Gardens in Pembrokeshire, I believe. We went there and it was fruiting. I didn't actually taste the fruit. I should have done, because I haven't actually come across many Cornus capitatas. I haven't grown it myself. But yeah, so you can a whole range of fruits. You can eat fruits. You can eat there's nuts, leaves, shoots, roots. So it's a whole range of different edible parts, and then there's the herbs and woods, canes, all sorts of different produce that you can grow in a forest garden. And kind of key principle of it, yeah, it's it's productive, that you're growing. It's kind of useful in some shape or form, and it's wildlife friendly, because everything you're growing in there, you want it to maintain itself. And this is a key thing I keep coming back to, is native plants where possible, because they co-evolve with the wildlife. They provide, not only are they providing pollen and nectar, the pollinators, but they're providing the food stuff for the invertebrates. That's the critical thing. And it's in layers as well. So you've got different layers. You've got daily at the bottom there. You have New Zealand flax here, and then there is a Prunus sinensis, Chinese cedar, which has edible shoots, which are weird. They taste like beefy onion. They are the most incredible flavour. Use them stir fries a few times. It's great. They grow to a really big tree, but you keep it kind of pollarded, and you harvest that. So quite lovely. And you're using up all the kind of available space, and it's perennial, mostly perennial, and then some easy. This is a I was going to say artichoke, but it might be the other one, which is close relation to artichoke, which you grow for the shoots. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I do know it. But most of the time, the crops are perennial. That you're growing perennial vegetables, because they're less maintenance, and they're kind of more nutritious, less soil disturbance. But it's a balance. You can have annuals in a forest garden, obviously, and you can have annual vegetables, your standard annual vegetables. Annuals will grow very, very easily, so will self-seed, for example, nasturtiums and marigolds. So I have a whole course on this, which is £1 available from Gumroad, but I should put a link. I should publicise that a bit more. But the key guidelines for if you want to create a forest garden, is windbreak. Really, really, really important. So a windbreak protects the young plants protects plants when they're growing. So you're providing protection. There are key things to remember about windbreak. You're best off with a living windbreak, but whilst they're getting established, using dead hedges. I absolutely adore dead hedges, because the dead hedges basically 4 posts in the ground, and you fill it full of brash, old bits of branches and whatever rubbish you've got kicking around. So it acts as a windbreak. It's a place to put all your rubbish, all your kind of organic rubbish, which is like really woody and won't rot down the compost. It's also a fantastic habitat as well. And what I do is put like bramble roots and dock roots on the top of the dead hedge, and they just dry out. And by the time they've gone down, they're not going to really. If you put bramble or dock roots on a compost heap, they'll come back, and then you end up in all sorts of disasters. So they're brilliant. Dead hedges are brilliant, but windbreak hedges are cool. And then you've got to think about, with a windbreak hedge, you have to think about where you're planting them as well, and how high they get. It's always kind of plant for finer size. Tree spacing is the next important thing. Don't put your trees too close together. Plant for the final size, and then you want roughly it's what's a quarter to half of the average canopy diameter. So mark out how big the tree is going to get, and make sure you leave a bit of a gap in between, a metre or so between the final size of that tree. Because otherwise, what ends up is you end up having to do more maintenance to kind of prune stuff and keep it in check. And that for fruit trees, for cultivated fruit trees, you've got to use the right rootstock. That's really, really critical. If you have a look at the notes in here, there's just a whole lot of extra links and information in there. And then ground cover, native plants where possible. Always keep the ground covered. Yeah. So if you're annuals, bag of vegetables, then use a mulch. If you're in a forest garden, you're using ground cover plants. And then whilst the forest garden is getting established, what I tend to use is bark. Bark it doesn't rot as much as quickly as wood chip, so it provides a longer cover. And then gradually the ground ground cover plants you put in, native ground cover plants wherever possible, these will then get established over time, and yeah, they'll cover over the bark. And then you can use a temporary ground cover as well. In West Wales, white mustard is like the best I found. It's one of the best annual ground covers. So what you do is you put the plug plants in bark, and then you sow the mustard seed on top, and that grows up. And then you have, by the time that dies back next year, the other plants will get established. So, and that is ground ivy, really, really good. It's a fantastic, light-rooted ground cover plant, so I will be planting that as well. And then finally, nutrients. You can work out a nutrient budget. Basically, nitrogen, there's one marker there in the background. It's nitrogen and potassium, the two nutrients that you want to grow. So nitrogen, depending on the space of the garden, I always try and put an Italian alder in because they're lovely trees, very upright, and you can take the lower branches off, and they're beautiful trees and very fast growing, and they provide nitrogen. And there's members of the pea family, and what else we've got? Sea buckthorn, autumn olive, yeah. And then for potassium, there's a range of different plants, but comfrey is a really, really good one. If you grow native comfrey, this is the Bocking 14, the one in the photograph. Bocking 14 has been bred to be very high in potassium, but it's not edible. Whereas the native comfrey, which is Symphytum officinale, I believe, it is edible. I believe, but to check up on this, I think that Symphytum, the tuberous comfrey, Symphytum tuberosum, is also edible, I believe, but to check. So you can, yeah, it's worth having them as multiple crops. If you're going to have comfrey, get the edible one, and you can eat it as well. So the principles behind forest gardening is really working with nature. So my business that I have, one of the businesses I have, it's called Nature Works because it's like working with nature, and it's the title of this book. Oh, which one is it? Where's it gone? Where is my book? I've got a book, Creating a Forest Garden. Where is it gone? Oh, there it is. Look at that. So, Creating a Forest Garden, working with nature to grow edible crops. This is Mike Crawford's kind of book of forest gardening. So I really recommend that one. So work well. There's the book. Working with nature, vegan, organic, and natural. And it's really because, yeah, there's a lot to be said about the kind of vegan aspect of it, but really, it's that you don't want to have any other inputs into the garden. You doesn't need to be livestock in there. We don't actually need to eat animals to grow food. And organic and natural materials where possible, not using plastic. I mean, I have actually used plastic, and I continue to use plastic, but I try and cut down where I can because it's always a question of cost and time and getting a job done. But you don't really want to grow. You don't really want to be using plastic in anything. This is a picture of a hoggin path, which is in John Little's garden, and hoggin is like a mixture. There's naturally occurring hoggin, and then you can have mixes of it as well. But this also provides habitat. So native plants where possible. I love this photograph. It's a field in Herefordshire, and yeah, absolutely wherever you can. Obviously, you're growing fruit, you're growing edible crops, and that generally won't be native plants. Everything else, all the windbreak, or ground cover, then you do use native plants where you can. And the people really are at the heart of this. This is the People's Orchard. That's mine up there, Bob there, Nia's there somewhere, Sophie. And yeah, planting apple trees down in Poppet Sands. So there we go. Lovely. Right, let's have a little pause there for a second whilst I pour myself a cup of tea. We're going to move on to the wildlife garden. Any questions? I'm joking. There we go. wildlife garden. Let's move. Whoopsie. Let's move on to the wildlife garden. So for me, wildlife garden really is it's an integral part. It's just another aspect of a forest garden. You can have two of them together. So dog barking. I'll just ignore it. I'll ignore him. Go out for a walk a little bit. So the key elements for a wildlife garden is you're designing for ecosystems, and quite simply, there are two elements to this. When you're designing for ecosystems, you have that you're designing for all the species, and that is providing the habitat for those species. So that's where they breed, that's where they live, that's like the different stages of their life, the food that they eat, the water that they require, the shelter that they need. So it's kind of food and water and shelter, and then it's part of that is the native plant aspect as well. So those are the three key elements. So you're designing for ecosystems, creating a habitat, you plants where possible. God, how many times have I said that? So when you're designing for ecosystems, there is a brilliant application. Oh, which one is this from? Oh, I think this is the Darren, which is every area in the UK has a local record centre, and the records are stored there, and you will be able to get the data, you should be able to get the data for the species which are in your area. And this is, there's a fantastic chap called Yusuf Samari, who's a plant ecologist. He's brilliant, he's really, really good, and he did a search on the area around Kilgarren, and this just shows you 1 kilometre radius, and these are the species that are available, and it is fantastic. I actually can't remember the number of species. This is across the board. This is plant species and animal species and fungi, but it's a vast number, and some of them are protected, and some of them are rare. So what you really want to be doing, if there's a kind of focus, so for example, the marsh fritillary is one of the butterfly species, which is there's a big push for conservation in Wales by the Butterfly Conservation Trust, and the brown head streak or white head streak, the one which is lays its eggs on black thorn. I think it's a brown head streak butterfly. But as an example, this is what you're trying to encourage. You want to be able to you think of the species that you want to protect and enhance, and create the habitat and grow the food that they require. So you're thinking about the whole ecosystem. You're thinking about the different species in there as well. So this is kind of really, really interesting exercise. And the kind of question you need to ask yourself is, who is eating what? So the elephant hawk moth, this is the photograph, possibly the one which I got rid of, is eating. It's on the plant that it's on is a square stalked willow herb. So it also eats other things as well. And there's links, if you follow the links for the slideshow, you can see it. So fundamentally what you're doing is you're growing for these critters, you're growing for the invertebrates, you're growing for the larval stages of invertebrates, and then also as a pollen and nectar source for them as well. So invertebrates are the foundation of the food web. Well, yeah, plants are the foundation of the food web. Well, soil is the foundation of the food web, but they're all kind of related. So you're growing native plants, absolutely foundational. So you're thinking about nectar, pollen, and primary food plant for the larval stages of invertebrates. And this is John Little again. This is a rather beautiful dead hedge that he created, and you can be beautiful. This is the lovely thing about wildlife gardening. And he talks about structural complexity. So this dead hedge here is structural complexity. Gabions are structural complexity, and you can put in there's all sorts of different kind of nest boxes, bird boxes, cat boxes, raptor perches, ponds, boggy bits, lots of different growing mediums. There's all sorts of different habitat that you can create. So looking at the water, looking at creating dead hedges, living hedges at different sized, different sized plants within the different native mixed species, native hedge. And when you've got grass, there's I went to a fantastic plant life workshop a couple of years ago, and the chap there called Mark, his surname, and Schofield, and he was talking about even you've got a lawn, just cut it, try cut grass. But basically, it means cut it. There's one bit which you cut every month, and then there's one bit which you cut every 3 months, and there's one bit which you just leave. So you can have to leave for that year, and then just vary it, and it alters. So you're just creating 3 different habitats on grass alone. And crevices is like the kind of key thing. It's just little nooks and crannies and different types, because then you can start getting into what they're called. If you've got a compost heap and you have a cover on a compost heap with like slow worms and grass snakes, and you have a piece of corrugated tin, lots of different habitats and different spaces. So it's beyond the scope of this of this particular slide to talk about them all. But that just gives you an idea of creating habitat, and the biggest part of that is creating a pond. The biggest ecological impact is creating a pond. I think this is a link to, what is that link to? Ooh, I don't know what that link is to. It's probably to that link is probably to Lincolnshire pond plants. They do like a lot of native pond plants. Get native plants in there as well. Be careful, obviously. Any plant that you do, make sure you get the right plant for the right situation. And a range of habitat in the ponds. You have a range of different levels, and you've got like boggy bits, and you've got really quite relatively deep bits, and you have shells. So yeah, ranges of habitat, differences of habitats. So if you look at the crevices here, here we go, unit of structural habitat. This is a gradient I created for a client a couple of years ago. You've got, absolutely love that. That's sweet woodruff, gradient odoratum. A lovely ground cover, and then there's a spalliard fruit tree, and then this gabion here going next to the oak. It's put next to the oak, and it has like bee logs, and it has local river stones in there as well, and then this a bundle of branches, and that provides masses of habitat. And you can create the same effect with dry stone walls, and there's log piles, all sorts of different things you can do. So yeah, it depends what you've got, it depends what's in the area, it depends what your budget is and how much time you've got. But there's lots of different ways of doing things. And then native plants. Love this photograph. I can't actually remember where it's from. If something's not eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem. So it sounds counterintuitive, but what you want to be doing is to encourage. You want to grow stuff that that invertebrates will eat, but by doing that, then you get a balance, and then you get the predators. Yeah, and it's creating that balance. So, for example, I just did a very kind of quick example here about native plants, and this is, I like Japanese maples. Do not get me wrong at all, but I prefer hawthorns, and it's not just because of the way they look. It's not just because they have beautiful blossom and amazing berries, but it's also because the amount of wildlife that they support. So, and this is in the UK. Can I just hasten to add, it's nothing against Japanese maples, but in the UK, the number of recorded interactions between a Japanese maple and the native wildlife is 1. Whereas if you look at hawthorn, the number of interactions is 197. And this is from a website. I had to put it horizontally to put it on. And this is from a website called Database of Insects and Their Food Plants. So hawthorns are brilliant and for wildlife, and Japanese maples aren't so brilliant for wildlife. Not to say that wildlife won't nest in a Japanese maple, or that they don't look pretty, but they don't support the number of invertebrates. So get hawthorn in there where you can. So where do you put the native plants? So this is really, I think this is kind of really exciting area, and I wish I had some respect. I wish I had a bit more time to explore the different possibilities. You use native plants as the bulk Um, there's a famous chap called Doug. Oh, Bucky Moses. Oh, nature's best hope. Doug Tallamy, Professor Doug Tallamy, and he had a phrase which was 2/3 for the birds, and so 2/3 of the biomass in the garden is grown for birds. Well, it's grown for insects, which birds don't eat. So that's what you're after, is a biomass bulk. So in a forest garden, what you're looking at is windbreaks. So this is, what's that? Awful. I can't actually see my glasses on. Ground cover, and on the windbreak side of things as well, there's the whole range of different species that aren't commonly used, but there's lots of different alder buckthorn, Persian buckthorn, Guelder rose. They can use hawthorn, and there's a lot of these plants that you grow in windbreaks. Again, plant for final size, unless you are growing a hedge that you don't mind laying, because what can happen is if you put more of a tree into a hedge, then it will thin out at the bottom, so you don't get the benefits of it being a windbreak hedge. Whereas some species will actually bulk out and they'll fill out that space. So it depends on what you're doing and how you're managing that hedge. Now, for the ground cover, this is ground ivy. There are again a whole range of different species that you can use: sweetwood ruff, bugle, Aguga redhands, a whole range of different ones. And it'd be nice to explore the kind of which ones are most effective in which situations. So I'm going to be playing around with different ground covers in that garden. And then finally is the system plants. So some plants, so nitrogen fixing. So sea buckthorn. This is a photograph from my garden, my old garden. And it's sea buckthorn. It can sucker quite a lot, but it's a really, really good. It fixes nitrogen, and they grow berries as well. So by the species, by a variety. So you can have a system plant that provides nitrogen, and like sea buckthorn, it also gives you a crop as well. And yes, and I think the really, really kind of fundamental thing is every place is different. So Ravel in vernacular, and by this I mean if you've got a boggy, then work with boggy. This is around lead sundew. If you have dry cold limestone, then work with calciferous conditions. You work with what you've got. Work with the native plants that work in your area. You can create different pockets and variations within that, but work with what you've got. The Hope Garden is Ross pasture. It's heavy clay. It's wet corner. The water comes down to that corner, so I've had to put quite a bit of drainage in. And I'm building raised beds, and there's plotty eye. There's the banks there as well, which will have planted up on the top. So work with what you've got. Where are you in the country? What's your soil like? What's your rainfall like? What's the temperatures like? And then work with the conditions that you have. What grows there already? Work on that. And yeah, I just do want to say as well, all plants are useful. I mean, there's a fantastic website called Plants for a Future, which is a directory of useful plants. That nettles, you can use them for fibre, and you can eat them as well, make them nettle soup, and use them like a spinach plant. But the vast majority of UK native plants are on Plants for a Future, so all plants are useful in one shape or form. So yeah, they can be used in numbers of different ways, and just because you're not using it, I might not necessarily haven't harvested nettles for a couple of years, but it doesn't mean that it's not that the potential isn't there. So all plants are useful. You can use them for all these different ways. Edible, herbal. You can build things with them. You've got hazel poles. You can grow back. You can use corner stockwood for weaving. They're also their wildlife food and habitat. And then experiment, have a look, see what's around, make new friends, as in try out different plants and work and growing with different plants. So the lovely thing is there's so many different options, and with native ours, with with native plants, you get a lot of cultivars, a lot of named varieties which are being bred for their fruit. So, for example, the red currant is a native plant, but there's a load of different cultivars of red currant cultivars that you can grow. So they're better cropping, and they're called, the nickname for them is nativar. So it's a native plant cultivar. But generally, the cultivars aren't as good for wildlife generally. But if you for the home garden, I've got red currants and we've got hazel. Just two examples of native cultivars, but they're bred to be better cropping. And then also look at neighbouring near native. So, just as an example, there is a green water, Ulna spiritus, which didn't quite make it back after the last ice age. It didn't make it back to the UK, but it grows in Europe, on mainland Europe, and yeah, that's a perfectly good plant to grow. It's a neighbouring near native. Same thing with the sweet chestnut. I don't know what the original range of it would have been. I think the Romans brought them over originally about, crikey, a couple of thousand years ago to the UK. So you can use neighbouring near natives as well. So, bottom line, native plants where possible. Phew! Finally. How are we doing on the old time, actually? Oh, there we go, an hour and 16, that's good. So, have a little bit of a break. There we go. Now, I just want to talk about the community assembly. So, what is fascinating, this is a community assembly. I haven't got whereabouts it is. Can't remember. This is a photograph from Denise, who's a community activist. She's brilliant. And they don't actually. It's a group of people together sitting around tables. But the process is, for a community assembly, you have a particular thing that you want to discuss and make a decision about. A decision is like a decision-making process, and the kind of key thing is, I think that the key question is, is there a democratic deficit in politics generally, but also in general decision-making processes? There is so much to discuss about, how decisions are made, and like, we have representative democracy, but how effective is that? And are there better ways of making decisions? We are quite hooked up, I think. I'm just going to try and find you a book. There's another book, which is brilliant. Maybe not actually. I can't find it. One of my books has gone missing. There's a brilliant book called The Real World of Technology by Ursula Franklin. And in it, she talks about technology, but also appropriate technology for different cultures, and how technology can form a culture as well. And the reason I say it is because it's like there's a lot of kind of decision-making processes which you can argue actually exclude people from those decisions. So with Extinction Rebellion, they have one of their calls, one of their demands is a citizens' assembly to discuss the nature of climate emergency, to make decisions, because the representative democracy that we have at the moment is arguably subject to industry and corporate pressures that a citizens' assembly wouldn't be. So we're presented with the facts that we use an expert to advise a citizens' assembly, and a citizens' assembly is chosen by sortition, where you choose it from the general population, and people are compensated for their time and the right decision. So there's lots of examples across the world. The decision to legalise abortion in Ireland was arrived at by a citizens' assembly. They want exile for a climate emergency, and at a local level, community or people's assembly is a way. It's a similar kind of process, but there are lots of different ways of making decisions, and we're kind of very hooked up on representative democracy lots of arguments against it being democratic, but there are lots of alternatives. The key features for community assembly are, as I think I've said before, is non-hierarchical, and it's open access. Non-hierarchical means there isn't anyone in charge. You have a note taker. Do I come on to this later on, or I don't? You have a note taker and you have a facilitator, but they don't hold any more sway than anyone else apart from the function that they have. They're chosen. They're not necessarily the same people each time, but the decisions are made by the group as a whole. And this is the kind of interesting thing. There's a thing called sociocracy as well, which I kind of would like to look at, where decisions are arrived. Decisions are arrived at by agreement, not by voting. So you have to have agreement amongst everybody to make the course of action. So community assemblies are non-hierarchical, and they're structured, and the decision-making process is, and I'll just kind of explain very, very quickly. You have the thing that you want to decide about. So, what should we do about the nature emergency in our village? And you have a meeting about it, and you say there is a nature emergency, and what can we do to in our way to combat that? And you publicise it, and everyone is welcome to come along, and you can have experts who will give a presentation about the nature emergency in this case, in this particular area, and the information that they have, and possible actions. And you can have more than one. You can have more than one expert. You have a facilitator and a note taker, and the groups work generally around about 20 people, 25. Can work with more, but then you can start dividing into different groups. And what you do is you divide that group. You have the question, you have the evidence. The kind of experts are brought in to discuss, to give their view on what is being discussed, the evidence of what is being discussed, and then the group is divided up, and each of those subgroups then discusses that question and comes up with ideas, and each of the subgroups has a note taker, as a facilitator, and a note taker, and the note taker summarises what they're saying, and it all comes together at the end, and then at the end the decision is taken by the kind of group as a whole. So it's like the wisdom of the crowd, that being able to freely discuss different ideas, get them out to the open, people feel heard, and the decisions that can then be made. But I think it's kind of interesting. It needs a structure. It needs the driving force behind it for decisions that have been made. Okay. Anyway, so there are three pillars. Just very quickly, the three pillars for it, which I think are kind of interesting, because I'd like to represent these physically in the Hope Garden as well. But it's radical inclusivity, so you're making it as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, who wouldn't normally be able to attend. Active listening is where you are listening to all voices, and one voice, like mine, isn't dominating. White, male, middle-aged, middle class. That one voice isn't dominating the conversation. You're getting a whole load of different perspectives, a whole load of different views, a whole load of different lived experiences that aren't normally listened to, and that forms part of the process. And then trusting the process, that people will sign up to it and say, yes, we're up for this, and then there is this agreement, there is this consensus. There we go. So there we have it. That's the end of the beginning for the garden. But yeah, that was some shape or form, and now it's on YouTube for a long time. Thank you very, very much for watching. If you have actually watched this long, that's great.